They say when death takes a husband, a widow should vanish into the shadows of mourning, silent and invisible, erased from society until grief itself forgets her name. But what happens when it's not death that destroys you? It's your own blood. When the very people who should hold you become the ones who throw you into the darkness. Lady Eleanor discovered the answer on the worst night of her life. Standing in the rain outside her family's estate, her belongings scattered in the mud like garbage, while dozens of so-called nobles watched her humiliation as evening entertainment. This wasn't just rejection. This was assassination, social, emotional, absolute. Her husband was barely cold in his grave when her own brother declared her a curse, a burden, a woman who had somehow brought ruin to a man who was already drowning in secrets and debts nobody knew existed. But the truth didn't matter. It never does when people need someone to blame. And Eleanor, 28 years old, penniless and completely alone, was the perfect target. She had nothing. No money, no allies, no future. Society had already written her obituary, another forgotten widow who would fade into poverty and obscurity. Maybe become a governess if she was lucky, maybe something far worse if she wasn't. The cruelty wasn't just in what they did to her. It was in how easily they did it. How quickly her own family erased her existence. How effortlessly the world looked away. She was drowning, and everyone on shore was simply waiting for her to go under for the last time. But then something impossible happened. During her lowest moment as she stumbled down the estate steps trying to leave with whatever dignity she had left, a gloved hand caught her arm. Not roughly, not with pity, with certainty. The hand belonged to the Duke of Ashford, a man so powerful that kings consulted him, so wealthy that entire fortunes seemed like pocket change, so feared that people lowered their voices when mentioning his name. He didn't attend funerals of minor nobility. He didn't involve himself in family drama. He didn't save anyone, yet there he was. His ice-cold eyes locked on Eleanor with an intensity that made the entire crowd freeze. And then he spoke words that would shatter everything. "Lady Eleanor travels under my protection. Any word against her will be considered a personal offense to me." The world stopped breathing, because everyone knew what that meant. The Duke of Ashford didn't make empty threats. He didn't offer protection lightly, and he certainly didn't defend ruined widows unless something far deeper was happening. Was it recognition of shared trauma? Was it rage against the same type of cruelty he'd once endured? Or was it something even more dangerous? A powerful man deciding that this woman, this rejected, broken, humiliated woman, deserved not just survival, but to be treated like a queen. This is the story of a widow the world tried to bury alive, and the untouchable Duke who decided to make her untouchable too. Watch until the very end, because what happens next will completely change everything you think you know about power, protection, and what it really means to rise from the ashes. The funeral carriage hadn't even left the estate grounds when the whispers began. Sharp, venomous whispers that cut through the heavy air of mourning like knives through silk. Eleanor stood beside her husband's casket, 28 years old and suddenly alone in a way that transcended simple widowhood. This wasn't just loss. This was the beginning of her execution. Her marriage had been arranged 7 years earlier, a transaction between her impoverished family and his barely better off noble house. There had been no love, no tenderness, no partnership, just a roof over her head and a name that kept her from complete social irrelevance. Her husband had been distant, cold, consumed by business ventures she was never allowed to understand. And now he was dead, suddenly, suspiciously, leaving behind a mountain of debts that nobody, absolutely nobody, had known existed. But here's the truly devastating part. The debts didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had to be blamed, and Eleanor was the perfect target. Within hours of his death, the narrative had already been written. She was a curse, a bad omen, a woman whose very presence had somehow drained her husband's fortune and health. Her own family, the same people who had practically sold her into that loveless marriage, now looked at her with disgust. Her brother, the head of the family, pulled her aside during the wake and delivered the verdict with shocking casualness. "You've brought shame enough. You cannot stay here. You cannot bear our name anymore. You've taken everything from us." Everything? Eleanor had taken nothing. She'd barely been allowed to choose her own dresses. Every penny she'd ever spent had been scrutinized, criticized, controlled. She'd lived like a ghost in her own marriage, tiptoeing through life trying not to be too visible, too expensive, too anything. But the truth didn't matter when people needed a scapegoat, and Eleanor, powerless and female and conveniently vulnerable, was perfect for the role. The cruelty reached its peak during the funeral reception. While guests mingled with plates of expensive food and glasses of wine, her brother made his move. He had her belongings, what little she owned, thrown out of the family estate. Not discreetly, not privately. He had servants carry her trunks out the front entrance and dump them in the mud of the circular drive while dozens of nobles watched. Eleanor will never forget that moment. The sound of her possessions hitting the wet ground. The complete silence from the crowd. Not a single person defended her. Not one voice rose in protest. They just watched, some with pity, most with that particular kind of fascination people reserve for public humiliation. It's the same instinct that makes crowds gather around accidents. The morbid curiosity, the relief that it's happening to someone else. Her brother didn't even have the decency to do it quietly. "Take your curse elsewhere," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Our family has suffered enough because of you." The accusation was absurd. The cruelty was deliberate, and the audience ate it up like theater. Eleanor stood there in her mourning dress, rain beginning to fall, staring at her life scattered in the mud. She had no money. Her husband had left her nothing. She had no friends. Years of isolation had ensured that. She had no skills that could earn her living. Women of her class weren't taught to survive, only to ornament. The options racing through her mind were terrifying. She could become a governess if anyone would hire a woman with her tainted reputation. She could beg distant relatives who would treat her like a servant. Or she could simply disappear into the kind of poverty that swallows women whole and spits out nothing but ghosts. This wasn't just rejection. This was annihilation. Her own family had decided she was disposable, and society had agreed without even pausing to question the narrative. As Eleanor bent to gather her belongings from the mud, hands shaking, dress soaking through, she felt something inside her break. Not her spirit, that would come later. That would require her to survive this moment first. What broke was her last illusion that the world had any fairness in it. That family meant protection. That being good and quiet and obedient would keep you safe. None of it was true. She was alone in a way that made the word alone feel insufficient. But what Eleanor didn't know, as she knelt there in the rain gathering the pieces of her shattered life, was that someone was watching. Someone who recognized exactly what was happening because he'd survived something similar. Someone who was about to change everything. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There's so much more to Eleanor's journey, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The Duke of Ashford wasn't supposed to be there. Men of his status didn't attend funerals of minor nobility. It was beneath them, socially inefficient, a waste of precious time that could be spent managing empires or influencing kings. Yet there he stood at the edge of the gathering, a figure so commanding that even in stillness he seemed to dominate the space. People noticed him immediately, of course. They always did. The Duke was the kind of man who made rooms reorganize themselves around his presence. Conversations lowered. Postures straightened. Eyes darted nervously in his direction, trying to decipher why someone so utterly untouchable had decided to grace this mediocre funeral. With his attendants, he was 42 years old and had been powerful for so long that most people had forgotten he'd ever been anything else. His wealth was incomprehensible. Estates across 3 countries, investments that could topple governments, connections that made prime ministers nervous. But it wasn't the money that made him terrifying. It was the intelligence, the absolute surgical precision with which he dismantled anyone foolish enough to cross him. The Duke didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply acted, and when he did, the consequences were always devastating and perfectly calculated. People feared him the way they feared forces of nature, with respect born from the certainty that resistance was futile. But on this particular day, standing in the rain watching a widow being publicly destroyed, something shifted behind those ice-cold eyes. He saw the brother throw Eleanor's belongings into the mud. He saw the crowd's complicit silence. He saw the particular kind of cruelty that only families can inflict. The intimate violence of people who know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. And he recognized it, because once, a lifetime ago, he'd been the one cast out. The unwanted second son of a duke who'd decided he was expendable. The boy whose own father had tried to erase him through calculated neglect and social isolation. The man who'd survived by becoming so powerful that no one could ever discard him again. When Eleanor stumbled on the estate steps, trying to leave with whatever dignity remained, trying to carry her waterlogged belongings while rain plastered her mourning dress to her skin, the Duke moved, not quickly, not frantically, with the deliberate certainty of a man who'd made a decision and would not be questioned. His gloved hand caught her arm, firm but not rough, steadying but not possessive. The touch itself was shocking. The Duke of Ashford didn't touch people. He maintained distance the way other men maintained breathing. Physical contact implied familiarity, and familiarity implied vulnerability. Yet here he was in front of dozens of witnesses, his hand on the arm of a ruined widow. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet. Eleanor looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met, her gaze full of confusion and exhausted wariness, his completely unreadable. Then he turned to face the crowd, still holding her arm, and spoke in that voice that had ended political careers and launched fortunes. "Lady Eleanor will travel under my protection." Each word was deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "She will reside at my estate for as long as she desires. Any word spoken against her, any action taken to harm her reputation or well-being will be considered a direct and personal offense against me." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Offending the Duke of Ashford was social suicide at minimum, financial ruin at worst, and occasionally something far more permanent. Eleanor's brother went pale. The crowd collectively held its breath. This wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented. The Duke didn't involve himself in drama. He didn't rescue anyone. He certainly didn't publicly align himself with scandalous widows. Yet here he was, drawing a line in the mud-soaked ground that no one would dare cross. As he guided Eleanor toward his carriage, black and sleek and bearing his family crest, she found her voice enough to whisper, "Why?" He didn't look at her, just continued walking with that same unhurried certainty. "Because I've learned that the people society discards are often the ones who deserved protection most." It wasn't an answer. It was a philosophy, and as the carriage door closed behind them, sealing her away from the crowd's shocked stares, Eleanor realized something terrifying. Her life had just been saved by the most dangerous man in the country, and she had absolutely no idea what he wanted in return. Eleanor wasn't naive. She'd survived 7 years in a loveless marriage, navigated the treacherous waters of noble society, and endured public humiliation. She knew one fundamental truth: powerful men didn't protect ruined women without expecting something in return. The carriage ride to the Duke's estate was suffocating with unasked questions. The interior was luxury itself: velvet seats, polished wood, the faint scent of expensive tobacco. But Eleanor couldn't appreciate any of it. She sat rigid against the cushions, still wet from the rain, her mind racing through possibilities. What did he want? Her gratitude expressed in predictable ways? Her silence about something he needed buried? Was she being rescued or collected? The Duke sat across from her, perfectly still, reading correspondence as if he transported traumatized widows every day. The casual indifference was somehow more unnerving than overt attention would have been. She needed to know. Waiting for the other shoe to drop was its own kind of torture. "Your Grace," Eleanor finally said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I must ask what you expect from me in exchange for this protection." He looked up from his papers, those unnervingly intelligent eyes fixing on her with an expression she couldn't decipher. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her face as if reading a document written in a foreign language. Then he set his correspondence aside with deliberate care. "What do you think I want?" It wasn't a deflection. It was a genuine question, tinged with what might have been curiosity. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "I think men of your position don't make grand gestures without expecting compensation. I have no money, no connections, no influence, which means the only thing I have to offer is—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she meant. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment? Anger? "Is that truly what you think of me?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made Eleanor's breath catch. "That I would extract that particular price from a woman who just lost everything?" Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite her fear. "I think you're a man who built an empire on calculated decisions. Nothing you do is without purpose. So yes, Your Grace, I'm asking what the purpose is here. What do you gain from protecting me? The silence that followed felt eternal. Then unexpectedly, the Duke did something she'd never seen him do. He smiled. Not a broad smile, just a slight curve of his mouth that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. "You're right. I don't make decisions without purpose." He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the small space between them. "My purpose is this: I was once discarded by my own family, cast aside as the unwanted second son, deemed unnecessary, expendable. I survived by becoming so powerful that no one could ever dismiss me again. But I remember what it felt like to be thrown away by the people who were supposed to protect me. I remember the rage, the helplessness, the bone-deep understanding that you mean nothing to the people who should love you most." His voice never rose, but the intensity behind the words was devastating. "When I saw your brother throw your belongings in the mud, I saw my father ordering my possessions removed from the family wing. When I heard him call you a curse, I heard my own blood calling me a disappointment. So you ask what I gained from protecting you?" He sat back, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. "I gained the satisfaction of ensuring that what happened to me, what happened to you, doesn't define your entire existence." Eleanor stared at him, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his honesty. This wasn't pity. It wasn't desire masquerading as charity. It was recognition. Two people who'd been discarded by those who should have cherished them, finding each other across the wreckage. "You'll have your own wing of the estate," he continued, his tone becoming businesslike again. "Your own staff, your own schedule. You're not a prisoner and you're not an obligation. You're simply someone under my protection, for as long as you choose to accept it. No debts, no expectations, no prices to be paid." Eleanor felt something dangerous rising in her chest. Hope. The kind of hope that could destroy you if it turned out to be a lie. "And if I choose to leave?" she asked, testing the boundaries of this impossible offer. The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then you leave, with enough money to establish yourself independently, and a letter of recommendation that will open any door you choose. Your freedom is not negotiable, Lady Eleanor." It's the entire point, as the carriage rolled through the gates of his estate, an enormous manor that looked more like a palace. Eleanor realized something that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. She believed him. This dangerous, powerful, untouchable man had just offered her something no one else ever had: the freedom to exist without owing anyone anything. And that was more valuable than all the wealth in his empire. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor could breathe. Not the shallow, anxious breathing of someone constantly bracing for the next blow, but deep, full breaths that filled her lungs with something that felt dangerously close to peace. The Duke's estate was beyond anything she'd imagined. Sprawling gardens that seemed to stretch into eternity, rooms filled with art and books and light, staff who treated her with quiet respect rather than contempt or pity. But the physical luxury wasn't what changed her. It was the absence of judgment, the freedom from constant surveillance and criticism. For the first time since childhood, maybe for the first time ever, Eleanor existed in a space where she didn't have to apologize for breathing. The Duke kept his promise with almost unsettling precision. He gave her an entire wing, the East Wing, with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning sun and turned everything golden. Her own sitting room, her own study, her own bedroom with a bed so large and comfortable that the first night she slept 12 hours straight, her body finally releasing years of accumulated tension. He assigned her a lady's maid, Mrs. Carson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who never asked invasive questions and seemed genuinely pleased to serve someone who treated her like a human being. And then the Duke did something that would prove more transformative than all the luxury combined. He gave her access to his library. It wasn't just a library. It was a cathedral of knowledge. Thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Philosophy, science, history, literature, political theory, medical texts, poetry in 6 languages. Eleanor stood in the doorway that first day, overwhelmed by the sheer possibility of it all. In her marriage, she'd been forbidden from reading anything her husband deemed inappropriate for the female mind, which meant almost everything interesting. Here, the Duke simply said, "Read whatever you want. Take whatever you want to your rooms. The only rule is that you actually enjoy it." That casual permission cracked something open inside her. She devoured books like a starving person given access to a feast. Philosophy that challenged everything she'd been taught about women's roles. scientific discoveries that expanded her understanding of the world, political treatises that made her angry at systems she'd never questioned, history that showed her how power actually worked, not the sanitized version fed to noble ladies. But the Duke didn't stop at books. Within weeks, he began inviting her to dinner. Not intimate dinners for two that might suggest impropriety, but gatherings of fascinating people. Diplomats, artists, scientists, writers, politicians. People who actually thought about things and argued about ideas and didn't just gossip about who was sleeping with whom. At first, Eleanor only listened, terrified of saying something foolish. But the Duke had a way of pulling her into conversations, asking her opinion in a tone that made it clear he actually wanted to hear it. "What do you think, Lady Eleanor?" He'd ask when a debate reached an impasse, and then he'd wait, genuinely wait for her response. It was intoxicating. Her mind, dormant for so long, began to wake up. She started offering opinions that were sharp and insightful. She began to argue back when she disagreed, and found that people respected her more for it, not less. The Duke watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read but seemed almost like satisfaction, as if he'd planted a seed and was pleased to see it growing exactly as he'd hoped. Eleanor began to change in ways that went beyond intellectual awakening. She started carrying herself differently. The hunched, apologetic posture of someone trying to take up less space gradually straightened into the bearing of a woman who had every right to exist fully. Her voice, always soft and tentative, developed an edge of confidence. Her eyes, which had learned to avoid direct contact as a survival mechanism, now met people's gazes without flinching. The Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. But he never commented on it directly. Instead, she'd catch him watching her during dinners when she was debating some point with a visiting scholar, and there would be something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Not possession, not pride in his creation, something more complex, recognition of an equal emerging from the chrysalis he'd helped protect. And Eleanor realized something both thrilling and terrifying. She was becoming someone she'd never had permission to be before. Someone intelligent and opinionated and unapologetic. Someone who took up space and didn't say sorry for existing. Someone worthy of the protection she'd been given. But more than that, someone who was beginning to wonder if the untouchable Duke of Ashford might actually be as affected by her presence as she was by his. Eleanor's family couldn't let her be happy. Her very existence under the Duke's protection was an insult that festered in their minds like an infected wound. Every day she thrived was a day that reminded them of their cruelty, their cowardice, their willingness to sacrifice her for their own convenience. And people like that don't seek redemption, they seek justification. Her brother, the same man who'd thrown her belongings in the mud, began a campaign of whispered poison that spread through society like plague. The rumors started small, almost delicate in their cruelty. Eleanor had somehow tricked the Duke. She'd used feminine wiles, perhaps even dark arts, to ensnare a man famous for his imperviousness to manipulation. She was a seductress hiding behind widow's weeds, a schemer who'd probably driven her first husband to an early grave and was now working on a wealthier target. The accusations grew bolder. Some began suggesting Eleanor had been involved in her husband's death, that the debts had been her doing, that she'd somehow orchestrated his demise to escape the marriage. Others whispered that she was the Duke's mistress, that the separate wing story was a polite fiction, that she was living in luxury in exchange for the oldest transaction in history. The most vicious rumors claimed she'd bewitched him, used some feminine sorcery that had turned the kingdom's most rational man into a fool. Society, always hungry for scandal, devoured these stories with enthusiasm. Former acquaintances who'd watched her humiliation in silence now felt comfortable dissecting her character at parties. People who'd never spoken to her suddenly had detailed opinions about her moral failings. The whispers grew so loud they became roars. Some of the Duke's own associates began approaching him with concern. Old friends suggested he was being manipulated by a desperate woman. Business partners implied his judgment was compromised. Political allies warned that his association with a scandalous widow was damaging his reputation. The pressure was immense, calculated to make him realize that protecting Eleanor cost more than she was worth. Any other man would have crumbled under that weight, would have quietly paid Eleanor off and sent her away to preserve his standing. But the Duke of Ashford wasn't any other man. And when he learned the full extent of the campaign against Eleanor, his response was chilling in its restraint. He could have destroyed her family with a single conversation, could have ruined them financially, socially, politically within 48 hours. But he didn't. He waited because Eleanor surprised him. When she learned about the rumors, and she did learn because servants talk and society has no secrets, she didn't hide, didn't weep, didn't beg him to fix it. Instead, she walked into his study one evening, spine straight, eyes blazing with something he'd never seen in her before. Rage. Pure, justified, magnificent rage. "I want to face them," she said without preamble. "My family. The people spreading these lies, I want to confront them myself." The Duke set down his pen, studying her with that intense focus he reserved for truly interesting developments. "I could silence them for you," he said quietly. "End this tomorrow." Eleanor shook her head. "I know you could, and I know you would. But then they'd say I hid behind your power, that I couldn't defend myself, that I was exactly what they're claiming, a weak woman who manipulates strong men into fighting her battles." The Duke stood, moving around his desk to face her properly. "What are you proposing?" Eleanor's hands were steady as she met his gaze. "A ball. A public event where everyone will be present, including my family. Where they can't refuse attendance without looking guilty. Where I can face them in front of everyone and speak my truth." It was audacious, dangerous, the kind of move that could backfire spectacularly if she faltered even slightly. The Duke smiled, that rare, genuine smile that made him look almost dangerous. "You realize if you do this, there's no protection from judgment? No shield I can offer once you're standing in front of them?" Eleanor's expression was steel wrapped in silk. "Good. I don't want a shield anymore. I want a witness. Someone standing beside me not as a protector, but as an equal. Can you do that?" For a long moment the Duke said nothing. Then he extended his hand, not to save her, not to lead her, but as a partner offering alliance. "I would be honored," he said quietly. And Eleanor knew as she took his hand that she wasn't the broken widow he'd saved months ago. She was someone who'd found her voice in the ashes of her old life, and she was about to make absolutely certain that no one would ever forget it. The night of the ball arrived like a storm that everyone could see coming but no one could prevent. The Duke's ballroom was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than most estates, marble floors polished to mirror perfection, walls adorned with art that museums would kill to possess. Every member of the elite had received invitations, and not one dared refuse. When the Duke of Ashford summoned society, society came. Eleanor's family arrived early, her brother wearing the smug expression of a man who believed he'd already won. He'd spent months destroying her reputation. Tonight would be his final triumph, watching her humiliated in front of everyone, forcing the Duke to finally see reason and cast her aside. But then Eleanor appeared at the top of the grand staircase, and the entire ballroom fell into stunned silence. She wasn't wearing black. After months of mourning, she'd chosen sapphire blue, the color of royalty, of confidence, of absolute rebirth. The gown was exquisite, cut to perfection, but it wasn't the dress that commanded attention. It was her. The way she held herself, like the stairs should feel privileged to support her weight. The way her eyes swept the crowd with neither fear nor apology. The way she descended with the measured grace of someone who knew exactly who she was and refused to pretend otherwise. This wasn't the broken widow they'd discarded. This was a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged forged into something unbreakable. Eleanor reached the ballroom floor and the whispers began immediately. Scandalized, fascinated, uncertain. Her brother saw his opportunity and took it. He stood from his seat with theatrical indignation, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "This is an outrage. That woman has no right to be among decent people. She's brought nothing but shame and ruin to everyone who's made the mistake of caring for her. She doesn't belong here." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Every eye turned to Eleanor, waiting for her to crumble, to flee, to prove she was exactly what they'd always said she was. Instead, Eleanor smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a cruel smile. A smile of someone who'd already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to realize it. She raised her hand, a simple gesture that somehow commanded absolute silence. And when she spoke, her voice was calm but resonated through the vast space with devastating clarity. You threw me into the gutter because it was convenient. Because you needed someone to blame for your own failures, your own debts, your own inadequacies. You used me as a scapegoat because powerless women make perfect targets, don't they? Her gaze swept the crowd, landing on faces she recognized. People who'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. I was the perfect victim, quiet, obedient, too afraid to fight back. But here's what you failed to understand. She took a step forward, and incredibly, her brother took a step back. I didn't need saving. I needed space to remember who I was before you all convinced me I was worthless. I needed freedom from your constant judgment to discover that my value was never dependent on your approval. The ballroom was utterly silent now. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Eleanor turned slightly, finding the Duke in the crowd. He stood perfectly still, but there was something in his expression that made it clear. This was her moment, not his. She'd asked for a witness, not a savior, and he was honoring that request with absolute precision. You've spent months destroying my reputation, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. Spreading lies about manipulation and seduction and witchcraft, as if a woman couldn't possibly have value beyond what she can offer a man. As if my worth is determined by your opinion rather than my own choices. She paused, letting the words sink in. But I survived. Not because someone rescued me, but because I decided my life is worth more than the poison of your cowardice. Then the Duke did something that no one expected. He stepped forward, not to speak for her, not to defend her, but simply to stand beside her. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely lethal. Lady Eleanor doesn't require my protection. She never did. But she has my alliance, my respect, and my loyalty for the rest of our lives, should she choose to accept it. It wasn't just a statement of protection. It was a proposal disguised as a declaration. A public acknowledgement that this woman, the one society had tried to bury, was his equal in every way that mattered. Eleanor turned to look at him, and for the first time all evening, her composure cracked slightly. Not with weakness, but with something far more powerful. Choice. She could refuse, could walk away with her dignity reclaimed and her independence intact. The Duke had given her that freedom, but instead she extended her hand to him. Not the hand of someone being saved, but the hand of a partner accepting an alliance between equals. The ballroom erupted, some with shock, some with outrage, many with the kind of awe reserved for witnessing history being made. Eleanor's brother stood frozen, his face pale, realizing he'd just been thoroughly, publicly, and irreversibly defeated. The rejected widow hadn't just survived. She'd transformed into someone so formidable that the most powerful man in the kingdom had asked her to stand beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. Eleanor had become untouchable, and everyone present knew they'd never dare underestimate her again. So what does Eleanor's story really mean? Why does it matter that a rejected widow found her voice and claimed her power? Because her journey is a mirror held up to every single one of us who's ever been told we weren't enough. Every person who's been discarded by those who should have protected them. Every soul who's been convinced that their value depends on someone else's approval. Eleanor's transformation wasn't about finding a powerful man to validate her existence. It was about discovering that she never needed validation in the first place. That's the revolutionary truth at the heart of this story. You don't need permission to be magnificent. Think about how many people walk through life carrying the weight of other people's rejections. How many brilliant minds stay silent because someone once told them their thoughts didn't matter? How many powerful voices remain locked away because families, partners, or society convinced them that speaking up was dangerous, inappropriate, or unwelcome? We live in a world that teaches people, especially women, to make themselves smaller, quieter, more acceptable, to apologize for taking up space, to be grateful for the bare minimum of respect. Eleanor believed that lie for years. She made herself small enough to fit into boxes other people built for her, and it almost destroyed her. But here's the thing about being broken down completely. Sometimes it's the only way to rebuild yourself into who you were always meant to be. When Eleanor lost everything, when she was stripped of every identity society had given her, she found something far more valuable. She found herself. Not the version of herself that had been trained to please others. Not the performance she'd perfected to avoid criticism, but the raw, authentic, powerful woman who'd been buried under years of conditioning and control. That's what the Duke recognized in her. Not potential he could mold, not weakness he could exploit, but strength that had been suppressed and was finally, gloriously breaking free. The real beauty of their story isn't that he saved her. It's that he had the wisdom to step back and let her save herself. He provided safety, resources, and space, but the transformation was entirely hers. And when he offered his alliance, he did it knowing she could refuse. Knowing she could walk away. That's what made her acceptance meaningful. It wasn't born from desperation or gratitude or fear of being alone. It was a choice made from a position of strength by a woman who knew her own worth. Eleanor's story is a reminder that the people who reject you are often the ones too small to recognize your value. That family doesn't mean unconditional worth. Sometimes the family you choose is more real than the one you're born into. That power isn't about controlling others. It's about refusing to let others control you. That your voice matters, your presence matters, your existence matters, not because someone powerful says so, but because you say so. Eleanor didn't need a crown to become a queen. She just needed to stop accepting the narrative that she was anything less. And the moment she did, she became absolutely unstoppable. That's not just her story. That can be yours too.